Picture a remote, bowl-shaped valley shrouded in thick jungle mist, located 190 miles from the nearest friendly airbase. Imagine an elite army of hardened paratroopers, foreign legionnaires, and armored cavalry dropping directly into this valley to build an impregnable fortress. They are the tip of the spear of a global empire, backed by American money, armed with American tanks, and confident in their absolute superiority. They are deliberately setting a trap for a peasant army, daring the insurgents to come out of the jungle and fight a conventional stand-up battle. But what happens when the trap snaps shut and the empire realizes they are the ones caught inside it? Welcome back to the channel. If you want to understand how superpowers lose to insurgencies, how arrogance destroys empires, and how logistics dictate the fate of nations, you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Today, we are stripping away the myths and diving deep into the tactical nightmare of Dien Bien Phu, the battle that broke the French Empire and drew the United States into the longest war of its 20th century history. To understand the sheer scale of the disaster that unfolded in the spring of 1954, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic chessboard of post-World War II Indochina. The French had returned to Vietnam after the Japanese surrender in 1945, expecting to easily reclaim their prized colonial possession. But the world had changed, and the Vietnamese nationalist and communist movement, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh and his military mastermind Vo Nguyen Giap, had no intention of going back to the old world order. By 1953, the First Indochina War had been raging for 7 brutal years. France was bleeding out, losing thousands of its officers and soldiers in a war without front lines, fighting an enemy that struck from the shadows and vanished into the triple canopy jungle. The war was massively unpopular back in Paris, draining the national treasury and fracturing the political landscape. The United States, terrified of the domino theory and the spread of communism across Southeast Asia, was footing the bill, paying for nearly 80% of the French war effort through the Mutual Defense Assistance Act. But American dollars could not buy French tactical competence. Enter General Henri Navarre, a highly decorated intelligence officer and cavalryman who was sent to Indochina in May 1953 with a specific, desperate mandate. Navarre was not sent to win the war in a total sense, because Paris already knew that was impossible. He was sent to achieve a crushing military victory that would break the back of the Viet Minh main forces, allowing France to negotiate an honorable exit from a position of overwhelming strength. Navarre looked at his map and saw a fundamental problem that has plagued conventional armies fighting insurgencies since the dawn of time. How do you destroy an enemy that refuses to mass his forces, an enemy that will not give you a target to bomb, shell, and overrun? Navarre's solution was the concept of the mooring point, or the Aero-Terrestrial base. He wanted to drop a massive garrison deep into enemy territory, sitting right on top of their critical supply lines, forcing the Viet Minh to come out of the hills and attack a heavily fortified French position. It was a strategy of deliberate provocation, a high-stakes gamble designed to lure Giap into a meat grinder where superior French artillery and air power could annihilate the exposed communist infantry. Navarre chose the valley of Dien Bien Phu, a remote depression in the mountainous northwest region of Vietnam, near the Laotian border. The valley was roughly 11 miles long and 3 miles wide, a flat basin surrounded by steep, densely forested hills. Strategically, it sat squarely on the main Viet Minh supply route into neighboring Laos. By occupying this valley, Navarre believed he could sever Giap's logistics, protect Laos from invasion, and simultaneously create the ultimate killing zone. But history is full of commanders who chose the wrong ground and paid for it with the lives of their men. Think of the British at Yorktown in 1781, backing themselves against a river, expecting the Royal Navy to save them, only to find the French fleet blocking their escape. Think of the Texans at the Alamo, choosing to defend a sprawling, indefensible mission deep in enemy territory against a vastly superior force. 14 years after Dien Bien Phu, American Marines at Quezon would look at the towering hills surrounding their own isolated combat base and wonder if they were about to suffer the exact same fate. The fundamental flaw in Navarre's plan was his catastrophic underestimation of his enemy's logistical capabilities. On November 20th, 1953, Operation Castor commenced. Over the next 3 days, thousands of elite French paratroopers drifted down from the sky into the valley, quickly overwhelming the light Viet Minh garrison and seizing the old dirt airstrip. They immediately began fortifying the valley floor, constructing a network of mutually supporting strongpoints. In a touch of legendary, perhaps apocryphal French romanticism, the strongpoints were reportedly named after the commanding officer's former mistresses. There was Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Dominique, Claudine, Eliane, Huguette, and the isolated southern outpost of Isabelle. The man chosen to command this sprawling fortress was Colonel Christian de Castries. De Castries was a dashing aristocratic cavalry officer, a champion equestrian, a man who thrived on mobility, shock action, and the rapid maneuver of armor. Did the French High Command really believe that a mobile cavalryman was the right choice to command a static trench warfare siege in a muddy valley? Putting de Castries in charge of Dien Bien Phu was like asking a fighter pilot to command a submarine. It was a fundamental mismatch of leadership and tactical reality, but it reflected the supreme arrogance of the French High Command. They simply did not believe the Viet Minh were capable of mounting a sustained conventional siege. Let us break down the order of battle and look at the immense firepower the French brought into this valley. The French Union forces peaked at around 15,000 men, a hardened professional mix of the 1st and 2nd Foreign Legion parachute battalions, elite colonial infantry from Algeria and Morocco, Vietnamese loyalist troops, and local Thai partisans. These were some of the most combat-experienced soldiers on the planet, veterans of World War II and years of brutal jungle warfare. To provide armored muscle, the French achieved a logistical miracle of their own. They took 10 American-made M24 Chaffee light tanks, vehicles weighing 18 tons each, armed with a potent 75mm main gun and twin Cadillac V8 engines. Because the Chafees were too heavy to be airlifted whole, French mechanics in Hanoi cut them apart with blowtorches. The pieces were loaded into the bellies of Bristol freighter transport planes, flown 190 miles over hostile jungle, landed on the dirt strip at Dien Bien Phu, and welded back together by combat engineers right there in the valley. The French artillery was commanded by Colonel Charles Piroth, a one-armed veteran who had lost his limb fighting in Italy during World War II. Piroth was aggressively confident, commanding 2 battalions of American-supplied 105mm howitzers, a battery of heavy 155mm guns, and numerous 120mm heavy mortars. When asked if he needed more artillery, Piroth famously declined, stating he already had more guns than he needed and that no Viet Minh cannon would be able to fire 3i rounds before he destroyed it with counter-battery fire. The entire French defensive doctrine at Dien Bien Phu relied on the air bridge. Because they were completely surrounded by hundreds of miles of hostile jungle, every single bullet, every ration of food, every drop of medical plasma, and every replacement soldier had to be flown in from Hanoi. The French Air Force, flying a mix of F-8F Bearcat fighters, B-26 Invader medium bombers, and Cs-119 flying boxcar transports, was expected to provide an endless stream of supplies while simultaneously raining napalm and high explosives on any Viet Minh who dared to show themselves. The French sat in their valley, drinking imported wine in their command bunkers, listening to Edith Piaf on the radio, and waiting for the enemy to commit suicide against their barbed wire and interlocking fields of machine gun fire. But up in the hills, looking down on the valley floor, was General Vo Nguyen Giap. Giap was a former history teacher with no formal military academy training, a man who had learned the art of war by reading Napoleon and fighting a relentless guerrilla campaign. Did the French truly believe a self-taught insurgent could outcalculate the graduates of the finest military academies in Europe? Giap saw exactly what Navarre was trying to do, and he accepted the challenge, but on his own terms. Giap understood that the French strength was their firepower and their air supply, and he knew exactly how to neutralize both. He initiated one of the most astonishing logistical feats in military history, mobilizing a civilian army of 250,000 porters, known as the Dan Cong. These men and women carved hundreds of miles of hidden supply trails through the dense jungle and over sheer mountain passes, completely concealed from French aerial reconnaissance by the thick canopy. Their primary vehicle was the humble Peugeot bicycle. The Viet Minh heavily modified these bicycles, reinforcing the frames with bamboo, attaching wooden poles to the handlebars for steering and pushing them by hand. A single modified bicycle could carry up to 700 pounds of rice, ammunition, and artillery shells. By sheer human willpower, the Viet Minh pushed thousands of tons of supplies through the jungle, feeding and arming a massive siege force. Giap concentrated an overwhelming force around the valley, bringing in the elite 308th Iron Division, the 312th, the 316th, and the 304th Infantry Divisions. But the real shocker, the weapon that would doom the French garrison, was the 351st Heavy Artillery Division. The French assumed the Viet Minh could never drag heavy artillery through the mountains, and even if they did, they assumed the guns would have to be fired from the reverse slope, making them inaccurate and easily destroyed by Pyroth's counter-battery fire. The French were dead wrong. With the help of Chinese military advisors, Giap acquired hundreds of artillery pieces, including American-made 105mm howitzers captured during the Korean War, and Soviet 37mm anti-aircraft guns. Instead of firing from behind the mountains, tens of thousands of Viet Minh soldiers used ropes and pure muscle to drag these massive guns up the incredibly steep forward slopes of the hills overlooking the French camp. They dug deep, bomb-proof casemates directly into the front of the mountains, pointing their barrels straight down at the French positions. They camouflaged these bunkers so perfectly that French reconnaissance planes flying mere hundreds of feet away saw absolutely nothing. When the guns fired, they would be rolled out, unleashed over open sights with devastating direct fire accuracy, and immediately rolled back into the mountain before the French could return fire. By early March 1954, Giap had over 50,000 regular combat troops surrounding the valley, outnumbering the French garrison by more than 3 to 1. More importantly, he had over 200 heavy artillery pieces and anti-aircraft guns zeroed in on every square inch of the French airstrip, the very lifeline the French depended on for survival. The monsoon season was rapidly approaching, promising to bring low cloud ceilings and torrential rains that would ground the French Air Force and turn the valley floor into a swamp of red mud. General Nevers' trap was perfectly set, and the bait was in the center of the valley, but the hunter had quietly become the hunted. Down in the valley, Colonel de Castries and his men polished their weapons, completely unaware of the hundreds of artillery barrels pointed directly at their heads from the silent, dark jungle above them. The arrogant confidence of the French Empire was about to collide with the unstoppable, grinding machinery of a people's war. The stage was set for a slaughter that would echo through the halls of Washington and Paris for decades to come. At exactly 5 o'clock in the evening, on March 13, 1954, the illusion of French supremacy shattered with the deafening roar of over 200 heavy guns firing in unison. The Viet Minh artillery barrage did not arc high into the sky like traditional indirect fire. Because General Giap's men had dragged their American-made M101 105mm howitzers and 75mm pack guns directly onto the forward slopes of the mountains, they were firing point blank right down the enemy's throat. This was direct fire, meaning the 33-pound high-explosive shells were traveling on a flat trajectory, slamming into the French bunkers with terrifying kinetic energy and zero warning. A traditional artillery shell fired in a high arc takes 20 seconds to reach its target, giving infantry a brief window to hear the whistle and dive into a trench. When fired over open sights from a mountain overlooking a valley, the shell arrives almost at the exact same time as the sound of the gun firing. The French defenders on the northernmost outpost, codenamed Beatrice, had absolutely no time to react. Beatrice was garrisoned by the 3rd Battalion of the 13th Foreign Legion Demi Brigade, some of the most hardened, lethal combat veterans in the world. But human courage cannot stop forged steel, and the French engineers had made a fatal miscalculation. Expecting only light mortar fire, they had constructed their command bunkers and fighting positions using thin timber, corrugated iron, and a few feet of packed earth. These roofs were instantly pulverized by the armor-piercing and delay-fuse shells raining down from the jungle canopy. Within the first hour, a direct hit obliterated the French command bunker on Beatrice, instantly killing the battalion commander and his entire staff. How does a professional, modern army, equipped with aerial reconnaissance and sophisticated intelligence networks, completely miss an entire artillery division digging into a mountain right in front of their faces. The answer is a lethal combination of institutional arrogance and a failure to understand the sheer willpower of an enemy fighting for national survival. The French simply believed that a peasant army lacked the mechanical transport to move heavy artillery, completely ignoring the fact that human muscle, driven by ideological fervor, can accomplish logistical miracles. As the sun set, the artillery shifted to a rolling barrage, and the Viet Minh infantry swarmed out of the trench lines they had secretly dug to, within a few hundred yards of the French wire. They attacked using a highly coordinated assault method, spearheaded by sappers carrying Bangalore torpedoes. These were long metal tubes packed with TNT, shoved under the French barbed wire and detonated to blast clear lanes for the infantry. The legionnaires fought with desperate, savage fury, manning their water-cooled 30-caliber machine guns until the barrels melted, cutting down hundreds of attackers in the flickering light of flares. But the sheer mass of the Viet Minh 312th Division was overwhelming, filtering through the shattered wire, clearing trenches with hand grenades and submachine guns. By midnight, Beatrice had fallen, and nearly 500 elite French troops were dead or captured. The shockwave that hit the French command bunker in the center of the valley was absolute. The next night, March 14th, Giap turned his artillery on the northwestern outpost Gabriel, defended by the fiercely proud 5th Algerian Tirailleurs. The bombardment was even more intense, turning the hill into a cratered moonscape. The Algerians held their ground through multiple human wave assaults, engaging in brutal, hand-to-hand combat with entrenching tools and bayonets in the pitch-black trenches. Realizing Gabriel was on the verge of collapse, Colonel de Castries ordered a mechanized counterattack at dawn, committing his armored reserve. This is where we must analyze the weapon system the French relied on for mobile shock action, the American-built M24 Chaffee light tank. The Chaffee was a beautiful machine for its intended role as a reconnaissance vehicle in World War II, powered by twin Cadillac V8 engines and armed with a highly accurate 75mm M6 gun. But in the muddy, restrictive terrain of Dien Bien Phu, the Chaffee was an absolute liability. Weighing 18 tons, its narrow tracks churned the soft valley floor into a quagmire, severely limiting its off-road mobility and forcing the tanks to stick to predictable dirt paths. More importantly, the Chaffee was a light tank, wrapped in a maximum of 1.5 inches of steel armor. That was enough to stop heavy machine gun fire, but it was absolutely useless against the Soviet-supplied 57mm recoilless rifles and bazookas carried by the Viet Minh infantry. As the French armored column rumbled toward Gabriel, they were ambushed by Viet Minh anti-tank teams hidden in the tall elephant grass. The Chafees were forced to halt and fight as static pillboxes, their mobility neutralized, their thin armor easily pierced. The counterattack bogged down in a storm of mortar fire and burning steel, failing to reach the trapped Algerians. By the morning of March 15th, Gabriel was lost, and the French perimeter was rapidly shrinking. Down in the central command bunker, the psychological toll was devastating. Colonel Charles Piroth, the one-armed artillery commander who had arrogantly promised to silence any Viet Minh guns, was faced with the catastrophic reality of his failure. His 155mm guns were firing blindly into the vast jungle, unable to locate the deeply entrenched, camouflaged enemy batteries. Unable to live with the guilt of watching his infantry being slaughtered without the ability to protect them, Piroth retreated to his dugout, pulled the pin on a hand grenade with his teeth, and held it to his chest. The suicide of the artillery commander was heavily censored by the French High Command to prevent a total collapse of morale, but the men in the trenches knew the truth. They were trapped, they were outgunned, and they were entirely dependent on the sky for survival. But Giap was already closing the noose on the French air bridge. The Viet Minh had deployed dozens of Soviet M1939 37mm anti-aircraft guns, ringing the valley in a deadly flak trap. These guns fired 2-pound, high-explosive fragmentation shells at a rate of 160 rounds per minute, creating a wall of flying shrapnel over the airstrip. The primary French cargo plane was the C-119 Flying Boxcar, a massive twin-engine American transport designed to drop heavy loads from low altitudes. To avoid the lethal curtain of 30mm flak, The French and American mercenary pilots were forced to fly higher and higher, eventually dropping supplies from 8,000 feet. At that altitude, wind drift became a massive, uncontrollable variable. Parachutes carrying vital ammunition, medical supplies, and food began drifting directly into the Viet Minh lines. The French were literally resupplying the enemy army that was trying to kill them. Think about the German Sixth Army trapped at Stalingrad in 1942, when Hermann Göring promised Hitler the Luftwaffe could supply them from the air. The German air bridge failed because they lacked the cargo capacity and faced a brutal winter, dooming hundreds of thousands of men to starvation and capture. Navarre made the exact same fatal assumption at Dien Bien Phu, banking the survival of his elite army on an air bridge that was being systematically dismantled by peasant anti-aircraft gunners. By late March, the dirt airstrip was completely cratered by artillery fire, littered with the burned-out wreckage of French fighter planes, and permanently closed to incoming flights. From that moment on, the only way into Dien Bien Phu was to jump. What goes through the mind of a professional paratrooper, standing in the open door of a C-119 at 3,000 feet, looking down at a valley that is literally erupting in fire, knowing he is jumping into a doomed, surrounded fortress? Yet, thousands of French, Legionnaire, and Vietnamese airborne troops volunteered to jump into the meat grinder, a testament to unit cohesion and a stubborn, fatalistic pride. As April arrived, the tactical situation deteriorated from a modern mechanized battle into a horrific, subterranean nightmare reminiscent of the Western Front in World War I. The spring monsoon rains began to fall, turning the valley floor into a sea of viscous red clay mud. Trenches collapsed, dugouts filled with waist-deep water, and the stench of unburied corpses baking in the tropical humidity became unbearable. Because the French medical bunkers were overflowing and evacuation flights were impossible, hundreds of wounded soldiers lay in the mud, their bandages soaked in filthy water, their wounds infested with maggots. General Giap changed his tactics, moving away from costly human wave assaults and adopting a strategy of strangulation. He ordered his men to dig a massive, intricate network of trenches, spider holes, and sap lines, pushing closer and closer to the French wire every single night. These trenches were dug in a zigzag pattern to prevent French machine gunners from firing down the length of them. The Viet Minh infantry practically lived in these muddy ditches, enduring relentless French artillery and napalm strikes delivered by B-26 Invader bombers. The battle shifted to the eastern ridge, a series of low hills code-named Elion and Dominique, which directly overlooked the central French command post. If Giap took these hills, he could fire heavy machine guns directly into de Castries' bunker. The fighting for Elion I and Elion II was some of the most savage, intimate combat of the 20th century. It was a battle of hand grenades, flamethrowers, and sharpened spades, fought at ranges of less than 10 yards in trenches, slick with blood and monsoon rain. Compare this to the United States Marines assaulting Sugarloaf Hill on Okinawa in 1945. The Marines faced a deeply entrenched, fanatical enemy utilizing interlocking fields of fire and subterranean tunnels, resulting in a horrific war of attrition where ground was measured in bloody inches. The French paratroopers on Elion fought with that exact same desperate ferocity, launching counterattack after counterattack, retaking lost trenches in the dead of night, only to be blasted out again by massed artillery at dawn. The French dropped napalm so close to their own lines that the heat blistered the paint on their helmets. The M24 Chaffee tanks, now completely immobilized in the mud, were used as static artillery, firing their 75mm guns until the barrels glowed red-hot and the recoil mechanisms failed. But the sheer numbers of the Viet Minh, constantly resupplied by the invisible army of bicycle boarders pushing through the jungle, slowly ground the French down. By late April, the French perimeter was compressed into a tiny, muddy footprint barely a mile wide, a graveyard of shattered armor, shredded parachutes, and exhausted, starving soldiers. Ammunition was critically low, the artillery was running out of shells, and the men were surviving on half rations of muddy rice and contaminated water. They were holding on by pure, unadulterated battlefield discipline, waiting for a miracle intervention from American B-29 bombers that would never come. But beneath the blood-soaked earth of Hill Elion II, Viet Minh coal miners from the Tonkin Delta were quietly swinging pickaxes in the dark, packing thousands of pounds of high explosives into a subterranean tunnel, preparing to blow the heart right out of the French defense. On the night of May 6, 1954, the ground beneath the French defenders on Hill Elian II simply ceased to exist. 2,000 pounds of TNT, painstakingly packed into a subterranean mineshaft by Viet Minh coal miners, detonated with a concussive shockwave that physically lifted the hilltop into the night sky. The explosion vaporized the French paratroopers holding the bunker and sent a plume of pulverized red clay and shattered timber raining down over the entire valley. Before the dust could even begin to settle, the final overwhelming human wave of Viet Minh infantry surged out of their trenches, screaming through the black smoke and pouring into the massive crater. The French perimeter, already compressed into a suffocating, muddy footprint barely the size of a baseball stadium, finally cracked. For 55 days, these elite legionnaires, colonial troops, and paratroopers had fought a subterranean nightmare, enduring relentless artillery fire, knee-deep mud, and the stench of their own unburied dead. They had fired their American-supplied 105mm howitzers until the recoil springs snapped, and the ammunition bunkers were completely empty. By the morning of May 7th, there was nothing left to shoot, nowhere left to fall back to, and absolutely no hope of rescue. Down in the Central Command bunker, surrounded by the moans of thousands of wounded men lying in filthy, flooded trenches, General Christian de Castries picked up the radio for the last time. He contacted his superiors in Hanoi, reporting that the enemy was swarming over the final barbed wire barriers, and that he was ordering his men to cease fire. The French High Command, sitting safely in their air-conditioned offices hundreds of miles away, coldly ordered de Castries not to raise a white flag, demanding that the garrison die on its feet to preserve the honor of the French army. At 5:30 in the afternoon, the radio went dead, and an eerie, unnatural silence fell over the valley of Dien Bien Phu for the first time in nearly 2 months. The French Empire in Indochina did not die with a bang, but with the quiet, exhausted surrender of 10,000 starving, shell-shocked men. How does a modern mechanized superpower, backed by the industrial might of the United States, lose a set-piece battle to a peasant army that arrived on foot? To answer that, we must dissect the tactical and strategic autopsy of this disaster, because the lessons ignored here would cost tens of thousands of American lives just a decade later. The most glaring failure of the French High Command was their absolute, unshakable arrogance, a deadly hubris that blinded them to the reality of their enemy. Think of General George Armstrong Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Custer arrogantly divided his 7th Cavalry, ignored the scouts who warned him of a massif encampment, and charged headlong into a valley, assuming the Native American warriors would simply scatter at the sight of his troops. General Henri Navarre made the exact same fatal miscalculation on a much larger scale. He assumed the Viet Minh were incapable of massing forces, incapable of sustaining a siege, and fundamentally incapable of dragging heavy artillery through a trackless jungle. Arrogance in military planning is not just a character flaw, it is a catastrophic force multiplier for the enemy. The French built their entire strategy around the concept of the Aero-Terrestrial base, relying 100% on an air bridge to supply a fortress completely surrounded by hostile territory. But air power has distinct, hard limitations, especially in a tropical environment. The French Air Force relied on World War II-era F-8F Bearcat fighters and B-26 Invader medium bombers, aircraft designed to hit visible conventional targets. But the jungle canopy of Vietnam is a black hole for aerial reconnaissance. You cannot bomb what you cannot see, and General Giap's forces were masters of camouflage, digging their artillery into the forward slopes of the mountains and covering their supply trails with woven bamboo trellises. When the monsoon rains arrived, dropping the cloud ceiling to mere hundreds of feet, the French Air Force was effectively grounded, while the Viet Minh artillery continued to fire with terrifying precision accuracy. 14 years later, in 1968, General Giap would attempt to recreate the exact same trap against the United States Marines at the Khe Sanh combat base. Giap surrounded the isolated Marine outpost with tens of thousands of North Vietnamese Army regulars and unleashed a massive artillery bombardment, hoping to achieve a second Dien Bien Phu and break the political will of the American public. So why did the Marines at Quezon survive while the French were annihilated? The difference was the sheer apocalyptic scale of American logistical and aerial muscle. During the siege of Quezon, the United States launched Operation Niagara, utilizing massive B-52 Stratofortress bombers to drop over 100,000 tons of high explosives on the hills surrounding the base. The Americans also used electronic seismic sensors dropped into the jungle to track enemy movements, and their C-130 Hercules transports were capable of delivering massive payloads even under heavy fire. The French at Dien Bien Phu had none of this. They were trying to fight a mid-20th century war with a shoestring budget and a logistical tail that was completely inadequate for the task. Let us look at the raw mathematics of logistics, because amateurs talk tactics, but professionals study logistics. To keep the French garrison fighting, they required a minimum of 200 tons of supplies dropped into the valley every single day. Due to anti-aircraft fire, weather, and a shortage of cargo planes, they rarely received even half of that, and much of what was dropped drifted into enemy lines. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh achieved a logistical miracle that defied every Western military textbook. They mobilized over 250,000 civilian porters, moving supplies down a network of hidden trails stretching all the way to the Chinese border. They used heavily modified Peugeot bicycles, reinforcing the frames to carry up to 700 pounds of rice and artillery shells per trip. A modern army relies on trucks, which require roads which can be bombed. A people's army relies on millions of human feet, pushing heavily loaded bicycles through mud and mountain passes, completely immune to strategic bombing. The French intelligence apparatus, the Deuxième Bureau, completely failed to detect the movement of the Viet Minh 351st Heavy Artillery Division. They failed to realize that Chinese military advisors were providing Giap with captured American 105mm howitzers from the Korean War, alongside Soviet anti-aircraft guns. This intelligence failure was compounded by a political and economic reality that was unfolding on the other side of the globe. By 1954, the French public was thoroughly sick of the dirty war in Indochina. The conflict was draining the French treasury and causing deep political fractures in Paris. The United States, paralyzed by the fear of the domino theory, was secretly funding nearly 80% of the French war effort, pouring billions of dollars into a sinking ship to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. As the situation at Dien Bien Phu grew desperate, the French practically begged Washington for a massive airstrike to save the garrison. This proposed American intervention, code-named Operation Vulture, would have utilized dozens of B-29 superfortresses flying from the Philippines to carpet bomb the hills around the valley. There were even high-level discussions in the Pentagon about using tactical nuclear weapons to vaporize the Viet Minh siege lines. But President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a seasoned military commander who understood the nightmare of getting bogged down in an Asian land war, refused to intervene unilaterally without the support of the British. When Winston Churchill flatly refused to join another war, Operation Vulture was cancelled, sealing the fate of the men trapped in the valley. The timing of the defeat was a masterclass in political warfare by General Giap. Dien Bien Phu fell on May 7th, the exact same day that international peace talks regarding the future of Indochina were scheduled to begin in Geneva, Switzerland. The news of the crushing defeat hit the French delegation like a physical blow, instantly destroying any leverage they had at the negotiating table. France was forced to accept a humiliating peace treaty, dividing Vietnam at the 17th parallel and officially ending nearly a century of French colonial rule in Southeast Asia. But the tragedy of Dien Bien Phu did not end with the ceasefire. Of the 10,000 French Union troops taken prisoner, only about 3,000 would survive the brutal, disease-ridden death marches to the jungle prison camps and the subsequent months of starvation and political re-education. The elite core of the French army in Indochina was entirely wiped out, leaving a power vacuum that the United States would slowly, inevitably, step into. Dien Bien Phu stands as a monumental turning point in modern military history. It proved that a technologically inferior, indigenous force could decisively defeat a modern Western army in a conventional set-piece battle, provided they possessed superior willpower, brilliant logistical improvisation, and a willingness to absorb horrific casualties. The French built a fortress to lure an insurgency into a trap, but they failed to realize that the jungle itself was the trap, and they had locked themselves inside it. The ghosts of Dien Bien Phu would haunt the Pentagon for the next 20 years, a grim warning about the limits of firepower, the danger of underestimating the enemy, and the absolute folly of fighting a war without understanding the political and geographical terrain. History is a relentless teacher, but she charges a heavy price for her lessons, and those who refuse to study the past are doomed to bleed for it in the future. What do you think was the single biggest factor that led to the catastrophic French defeat at Dien Bien Phu? A. The catastrophic failure of French intelligence to detect the enemy artillery. B. General Giap's brilliant use of human logistics and modified bicycles. C. The refusal of the United States to intervene with Operation Vulture. Drop your answer and your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if you want more deep dive tactical analysis, and make sure you are subscribed so you never miss a battle.